Good morning.
Good morning.
So, in the beginning, I said that the passages this week are kind of are heavier than other weeks, and then I start off with the two from the Old Testament. One is victory of God, and then there's the one from Isaiah, which is basically hope. And you're probably thinking, okay, Gord, what are you talking about? Fair enough. There is a message, a strong message of hope, and the one in Isaiah is particularly on point for us. Because Isaiah, as I have said before, is broken into three sections. The first section of Isaiah deals with the prophet when Israel is not following the words of God, or Judah, I should say. They are rebelling, they are focused on rich and wealth, they are persecuting the widows, the orphans. They're doing everything that they're not supposed to for their own interest. And God warns them that if they do not change, there will be punishment. And it comes with being exiled into Babylon. The second part of Isaiah is the word of God to the people when they're in Babylon not to give up hope. That God is still with them, that there is a promise for their redemption, that even though they are now in exile, they are still God's people and they will return home. The third part, which is where the passage that we had this morning comes from, is to the people after they've returned home. And they've come on the promise that everything will be glorious and wonderful. They're returning to the promised land, the land of milk and honey. And it's hard. To rebuild isn't just taking place. Their neighbors are hostile. There's infighting. They're doing the hard labor and they're moving forward. But they were hoping that everything would just be perfect. That they would come and with very little labor, with very little effort, everything would just flow out in front of them. And so now the message has changed. Instead of just being hope, but that God is still with them. And that where they are moving to is a place of peace and prosperity. But right now they are still called to do the work. There will be a time when the lion will eat straw. But right now they are the ones working with straw to build the bricks, to build back their houses and their kingdoms. The promise is set for the future, but it's a promise that calls them to continue to endure in the work that is in front of them. And this sense is often what we will read in Scripture, in the Psalms and in others, that what we are working towards is a new earth, a new heaven, a new way of being, where your children will not die until they've hit 100. And all of these promises that we go, wow, this is amazing. Someone who dies before they're 100 is considered a curse. But we're not there. And so for some people, they read it and they go, well, what does that mean? For others, they read it and they see that if they are faithful, if they do everything right, then that should be what's given to them right here and right now. And for a lot of people, that's a very tempting message. The prosperity gospel, it's a name that's often given. It's that if you are faithful to God now, you say your prayers, you attend church, you give your money, then everything will be made right and everything will be perfect. You send in your $99.99 and God will bless you tenfold with that money. That's all probably seen that on commercials somewhere. And I really wish that I could say to everyone, everything is going to work out. Everything is going to be perfect. Stay faithful, do what God has laid before you, and there will be no calamity, no hardships in your life. But that's not the case. So then the question becomes, what do we get from this promise of God? What are we given? What is the incentive for us to continue to try? And that's where the passage from Luke is so amazing. And, really, this should be a recruitment poster because Jesus the way that Jesus is enticing and calling people to come forward and to follow him, he says to them, There will be great earthquakes in various places, famines, plagues. He says that you will be arrested, they will persecute you, they will hand you over to prison. You will be brought before kings and governors. Don't worry what you'll say. I'll give you stuff to say, but you will be betrayed even by parents and brothers and sisters and relatives and friends, and some of you will be put to death. Now, is that not words that should be put on a recruitment poster somewhere? Like that's what Jesus is saying to the people that want to follow him. He's saying, yeah, come follow me, and some of you will be, it says all of you will be hated because of me. Some of you will be put to death, but yeah, come follow me. That's Jesus' recruitment speech. And who wouldn't want to sign up? And then to make it even more confusing, he says, they will put some of you to death. You will be hated by all because of my name, but not a hair on your head will perish. So I don't want to get morbid, but they say the hair continues to grow when you're in the coffin. Is that what is the purpose of this promise? And here is where the message comes to us, that we are promised something. And last week was about life after death with the Sadducees. But here we are told something that it's not just about the life that we are promised. That is what we are moving towards, but we aren't just told this to say that this is the life we will be given. So relax and don't do anything now. Jesus is telling you, yeah, the road is going to be hard. Yeah, there will be persecution, there will be hatred, you will be betrayed, there will be war, there will be famine, there will be plagues. All of this will befall you. But I will be with you. And in the end, if not in this life, then the life after, you will triumph. You will be okay. But first, you must walk this long road. And our faith tells us that even in the midst of pain and loss, of confusion, of despair, we are not alone. And that the path that we are on is the right path even when we do not see it at this time. It is that promise of something more, but the promise isn't just, okay, sit down and wait for it. The promise is to continue on the path that we have been placed as God's people. The prosperity gospel, in some ways they have it right. There is something great happening, but they got the timing wrong. And I am not saying that God will not bless us in this life, not by any stretch of the imagination. And I am not saying that we should not pray for blessings. I do all the time. But if the world does not unfold the way that I want it to, if things do not happen the way that I think they should, that does not mean that God is not with us or that we are not being faithful. One of the saddest things I come across is people who say, well, look at my life. Obviously, God is punishing me. I am not good enough. And it's this sense that they have failed God, and so God is punishing them. And they feel that God has abandoned them. And one of the most powerful things I hear is for people who are in the midst of trouble and despair, who are going through an incredibly difficult time, and who say to me, I would not be able to do this if it were not for God's presence in my life. That even in the darkest moments, I know that God is with me, and that is what is leading me onward. And you see such a difference between those who feel that God has left them to those who feel that God is with them on this journey. And in some ways, it can be kind of summed up in two. There are people who believe that God should make their world, the road in front of them, flat. No obstacles, no problems. Everything should just flow in front of them, easy sailing. And they believe that that's what they are entitled to with their faith. And then there are those who believe that God is with them and God gives them the strength to face the obstacles that they will come across. That God will give them the strength in their legs to climb the hills that are before them, and the strength in their knees when they have to go down, because right now sometimes going down is harder than going up. But that in their despair and in their difficulty, God is there. And so one walk with hope. and one walked with despair. And the difference is profound. I've shared before about the woman whose husband died, and she did CPR on him, and then she had to run the farm and everything, and all of these difficulties that came across her. And her words to me were, instead of saying, like, why did God let this happen? Why did God do this to me? She said, I could not survive this without the presence of God. Or the woman who suffered severe depression, a very, very dark time in her life. And her fear as she started to get better was, now I'm not going to rely on God so much, because God has been the thing that has got me through this. And she was worried that when things start to go well, she would forget to hold so tightly onto God's hands, because God had been what had got her through this. I wish I could say that everything is going to be all right. And I can, but with the understanding that that comes after. Because right now, I do not know what we will face. And there are people who have always been filled with despair for good reasons. The way that the world is going, the environment, politics, even just relationship with family, friends, and neighbors. There are all these things that we look at and we feel, what's the point? It seems as if in some ways it gathers momentum to push us down. And we can cry out to God and say, where are you? Why are you letting these things happen? Or we can say, thank you, God, for walking with me and giving me the strength. Because even though it looks like the evil has the upper hand, I do not believe that evil will triumph. That even though I do believe this world might be destroyed, I believe that there will be a new world. Does that mean I stop working for this world? No. In fact, it gives me the strength and the endurance to work for this world even when it feels hopeless. And that's part of what we get from God in this message, is that we are promised something here so that we continue to work for what we have now. It's not a stop trying, it's a keep trying and know that even though it feels futile at this point, there will come a time when we will look back and we will be grateful for what we did. There are times when, and you know, again, it's the analogy that comes to my mind. I'm trying to be a better driver. I am working to be more patient. I took Jason on an ETA, and Jason's first comments to me after like half an hour of the car was, he says, it's like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Like, you're just completely different behind the wheel. And I'm like, you don't know what you're talking about. Shut up. Shut up. Yeah, I get so impatient when I'm on the road because I want to go from A to B. But the other day, I was driving, and I thought, you know what, Gord, just, you know, and so I was letting people cut in front of me. Like, weird. I wasn't up on the bumper of the person. I was like, no, this is what, you know. And I waved people in and stuff, and they were like looking at me, and I was, and I realized, wow. And then, lo and behold, someone comes whipping past me and cuts off a bunch of people. I'm like, and I think, well, you know, all that goodwill was lost because this guy has now stopped everyone. And I thought, no, it's not. Because the simple act of doing something nice for someone makes a difference in their life and makes a difference in mine. It's not about the timeline of how fast I am going to get there. It's about what I have done on this journey. And in a sense, that's what Jesus is telling us, and God, to the people of Israel, to the followers of Christ, that it's not, the end is okay. The end will be fine. I will be there with you. So pay attention to what you are doing now. Pay attention to being the people who face the persecution and the hate, who are willing to face the despair and the loss and continue to be a light and a hope and make not only your life, but the lives of the people around you better. It is that sense of trust in a future, even when we don't necessarily have it. An example, I think I took it out because I've used it so often, but it always comes to my mind is when we moved here. Because Pam had a full-time job, I had a full-time job, we moved here, and we realized that the church can't pay me full-time because that's just the reality of it. And we're like, no, we feel called, we're here, and then Pam doesn't find a job. And the first like 10 months, I feel like when God, when you have a baby and you throw the baby up and the baby goes, ah, and then you catch it and it giggles. I felt like God had thrown me up and I was like, ah, and I'm like, you can catch me now, you can catch me now. Because it's not that I was regretting the move, it was that I felt responsible for the well-being of our children, the financial, like if we can't keep paying for the house, all of these things were coming to mind. Eventually God caught me, and Pam got a job, and everything worked out fine. How long?
8 months.
Felt longer. Felt like a year and a half. Waving my arms, catch me. But the thing is that even when we are in that point of doubt and fear, that's when we just say, I continue to live the life that God has called me. The promise that we are given isn't about not caring about what happens in the world today. It's not about, I've seen people with the bumper stickers, in case of rapture, this car will be in. And it's as if they everything is about what comes after. But no, what comes after has been assured to us. So what we are doing now is where we get a chance to be the light and the grace, the arms, the hands, the feet, the heart, the eyes, the ears of God. And it means that even in the face of despair and loss and hopelessness, we walk with hope. And the world might not understand it. We might not always understand it, but that is who we are called to be. And it's hard, and it's supposed to be hard, and that's why we are not called to walk it alone. We are called to walk it together. I could not do this without you. This congregation, Jason told me not to say this to you, but even this morning he was saying, like, what an amazing congregation we have. The fact that he said, like, when you asked, could inmates come, what did they say? And they said, of course. He goes, was there any hesitation? I said, no. Why would there be? And he goes, these are great people. I'm like, yeah, that's why God punished them with a bad minister. But it's that sense of we are called to walk this together. Abraham and Kendall were given the opportunity to buy a lot of land. They grew up in the city in a time when there was not a lot of future in their city. And so there was a promise by the government to give lots of land to people who are willing to move west and to start a farm. And Abraham said, this is our way to wealth and prosperity. And Kendall thought, well, this is my way out of the city. So the two brothers each signed up and got a lot of land. There was 40 lots, 20 on one side of the river, 20 on the other side of the river. And Abraham told Kendall, you take that side, I'll take this side. And someday we'll own this valley. And they got there, and the first things they discovered was that the poster that they saw that showed the flowing farmland with the wheat and the house and the ox pulling the land was rocky. The land had more stone than it did have soil. And the brush and the trees that they had to clear, the first year was brutal. And the winter was cold, and the summer, the mosquitoes were terrible. It was unrelenting. And at the end of that first year, they barely had enough to make it. And out of the 40 lots that were sold, 38 people, not 38, 18 on each side quit. They just gave up. And Abraham was right away, well, now we need to buy up their land so that we can make ours. But Kendall was like, I can barely make do. And so they held off any sort of expansion. And sure enough, more people came and then more people left. But those first 5 years, it was as if all their work that they did was for nothing. Then in the 6th year, they actually got a decent crop planted. And they got things set up. And by this point, there was half that number, 10 on each side. And Abraham had bought up a lot of the other, or more had just taken over a lot of the other land. But Kendall, his had grown a little bit, but not to this extent that Abraham's had. But they'd planted their crops and they were feeling good about it. And then the sky opened up and it rained. And it rained and it rained and it rained. And they stood there and they watched their fields get flooded. And one day it poured as if all the water in the earth was just coming across their little property. And Kendall went back and he thought of all the people he had known and all the people that had walked away, and he thought, I can't do this. Everything I do just gets thrown back down. And he packed his bag. He didn't tell his brother because he knew his brother would be disappointed, but he packed his bag and he put it beside the door and he went to bed. And it rained all night, and he lay there and he was thinking, well, I can work in a factory in the city, or I can deliver packages. Maybe I can get a work on the docks, emptying and loading ships. And he thought of all of these things that he might do. And then the last thing he thought of, I can maybe dig a trench and try to drain the water off of my land. And he woke up in the morning and he thought, why would I think that? And he hadn't even realized it, but the night before, there was the bag beside his door, and there was a shovel. And he had a decision to make. And he went and he grabbed the shovel and he started to dig to drain the water. And halfway through the day, the rain stopped. And then that evening, the sun had just peaked up enough to let them know that the next day would be warmer. But he worked all that day. He worked so hard, digging and digging, draining the water. And he came back that night and collapsed. He didn't even get into bed. He was just covered in mud. He lay on the floor and fell asleep exhausted. The next day he got up and he got a message from Abraham. Someone who was coming by had said Abraham had asked him that once he got his land, because his was not as much, to come over and help Abraham with his bigger property. But Kendall instead took care of his property, and then he went to his neighbor who had only been there 2 years, and he helped to drain his field. And then he convinced that neighbor that the two of them should go and help the next. And at the end of that week, all the fields on that side were doing okay because they had worked together. Abraham's land was doing fine too, because Abraham worked every bit as hard as Kendall did, and he hired people to help him. And those who weren't on his, who were his neighbors but not land he owned, he let them deal for themselves. And when he found out that Kendall hadn't come over and helped him to enlarge his property, and hadn't even tried to enlarge his own, but it actually helped his neighbors, who it would have been better for him if his neighbors had gone down and under, literally, so he could have taken their life. He was disappointed. He says, why are you doing this? He says, the only thing that gets me up every morning is the idea that someday you and I will own this valley. And Kendall just looked at him, didn't say anything, and just smiled and said, they continued on that way, and Abraham's land continued to grow until he had 8/10 of all the property on his side of the river. And Kendall's grew as well, but because when people were leaving, they were giving him some of their land. Say, here, take a quarter of this property. I'll sell the rest, but you have helped me out so much. So Kendall's grew, not to the extent that Abraham, his was maybe like twice the size now of what it was, maybe 3 times, but he didn't care about that. He had enough. And his neighbors all truly appreciated the work that Kendall did for him. Then when they started to become more organized, they were running, there was an election coming up, and Abraham was running. And Abraham at this point was the wealthiest, most powerful farmer, and he was running, and part of his agenda was to be able to make it easier to buy other people's land. And the smaller farmers were worried that they might get bought out by Abraham. And so they went to Kendall and said, why don't you run? And Kendall says, well, I don't want to run against my brother. And they said, well, if you don't run, no one else has the respect, and everyone will just bow to the money. So Kendall ran. And Abraham was furious. And he spent all this money on the election, and Kendall didn't spend any. And he was convinced he would beat Kendall, but he still felt betrayed by Kendall, and then was utterly amazed that Kendall won. And in fact, the percentage in that valley at this point that worked for Abraham was around 15%. And he had thought, every one of them would vote. He got 8% of the vote. Everyone else voted for Kendall. And after that, Abraham refused to talk to Kendall anymore. And it continued that way, that on the one side, on Abraham's side, it was his farm with just a few small little holdouts. And on Kendall's side, there was a bunch of fairly healthy, well-to-do farms, and there was really a sense of community. They did not talk for years and years, but when Abraham's wife died, Kendall went across to be at the funeral. And Abraham was still furious. And he went up to him, and Kendall says, "I am so sorry for your loss." And Abraham says, "Do you know how much this funeral is costing me?" Kendall says, I don't know, but I must imagine the pain. And because everyone has to have a day off from work that they're not working for this funeral, it makes no sense to me. Kendall just shook his head. And then Abraham says, "Why?" He says, "Why could you not be part of the vision? Like, what was keeping you going if it was not that you and I would own this valley? Like, what were you thinking? What were you dreaming of?" Kendall looked back and he says, "I was dreaming of having a farm, of working outside, of being a person that everyone could say, 'Hey, I trust him. I believe in him.' And I don't know if I have that or not, but I continue to work." That night, he said, when I looked at that shovel and that bag, because they both had shared that story, both had had kind of the same experience. And Abraham had chosen the shovel because he wanted to own it all. And Kendall had chosen the shovel, he said, because I knew that if I could get everyone, if I could show them what I could do on my field, I could get them all to do it on their field. I didn't leave because I didn't want to disappoint the others. We look at the promise of God and we say, what am I going to get out of it? And for some people, they want wealth and riches. They want power and esteem. And I get it. I give me $1 million, I would be able to do, I think, a lot of good with it. But much rather than selling ourselves for that promise of now, we hold on to the promise that what we will be given will be more than enough. And so what we work with now is to make sure that we are the people of compassion and grace, mercy and love. Like the Israelites, we are building the kingdom of God in a place and time when it feels almost hopeless. But we have hope because we have been promised something that will be given to us. If not in this life, then the next. And we have hope because the work in and of itself is worthy. To be kind to one another, to be gracious, to accept the love that we have and to share that love with others in and of itself, even if it leads to people persecuting us, even if it leads to us being imprisoned, even if it leads to our death. Still, it is such a better way to live. On Thursday, I was working on this message, and I was sucking air. I was coming up with nothing. And Thursday afternoon, there's a long hall. There's a hall, and then into the sacred space. And I was walking back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Like, what am I going to say? How do I talk about this? And part of it is I'm telling people to endure, to people who are going through one of the worst times of their lives. And how do I say, maybe it'll get better, continue to pray, but if it doesn't, still remain faithful. And I was trying, like, how do I put that? And I'm walking back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And then the idea comes to me, I can call the duty desk. And I can say, hey, make an announcement, chapel's canceled, and I can just go home because I can't do this. And it is not the first time I have had that thought. And before, because now I tend to work the bulk of the message on Thursday, but before there were times on a Saturday night when I was working on the message for here, and I was like, I can call in sick. I don't feel very good. And I didn't feel good because I couldn't come up with anything to say. And I was like, I can just leave. I don't have to try. And the temptation was there. And then I thought, so you want to disappoint? You want to tell them that, oh, sorry, I'm just going to leave and not have a service this evening? And so I had an idea. I sat down and I wrote it down quickly. And I was like, with like maybe 15 minutes to spare. And I wrote it down. And as I finished, literally last second, the power goes out. And I lose it all on the computer. And I'm like, this is God's sign. Go home, Gord, go home. And I sit there and I think, why? And then it comes to me in that way that it sometimes does. Because even if it's not the best message, even if you don't get all the points right, better to try than to walk away. Better to stay than to run. And I'm turning on the computer, and there's part of me wondering, like, sometimes the computer auto saves, like it depends on, like, did it keep any of it? And I thought, it doesn't matter. If the sermon is there or it's not there, I am here. And I will try as best as I am able. Because that's what's required of us. The sermon was there, hallelujah. But for us, that is the message for today. Try. We've been promised something amazing at the end, but it might not be experienced today or tomorrow, this month or next month. And maybe it will. I don't know. But I do know that the act of us trying to be the hands, the ears, the eyes, the heart, and the love of God, that in and of itself is worth the effort to keep trying.